Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Edwards, and I'm the Community Events Manager at Linux Professional Institute. Linux Professional Institute is the global certification standard and the career support organization for open source professionals. With more than 175,000 certification holders, we are the world's first and largest vendor-neutral Linux and open source certification body. We have certified professionals in over 180 countries, deliver exams in multiple languages, and have hundreds of training partners. Thank you so much for joining us today for the deep dive into why Linux is like pizza and how to choose a distribution that's right for you. Our presenter, Evan Leibovitch, will explain at a beginner level what a Linux distribution is and why so many exist, how to choose the right distribution for you, and how to prepare it for installation. During the webinar, we will have the ability to handle questions from our Zoom audience this time, so please type in the chat or the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. I will keep track and facilitate throughout the webinar. I'd also like to acknowledge our YouTube streamers today. Thank you so much for joining us. This webinar will be recorded and the slides will be shared. Today's webinar, as mentioned, will be led by Evan Leibovitch. Evan is one of our co-founders at LPI going back to 1999. He was its first board chair and helped grow the organization worldwide. He's back on the board of LPI and involved in our community engagement team, still making new friends and partners around the world. And he's currently based out of Toronto. Evan, why don't you please take it away?
Thanks a lot, Caitlin. Hello, everybody. Happy to be here. And I hope you're all doing okay through COVID. And let's get underway. As Caitlin said, I was involved in the founding of LPI. I've been heavily involved in open source community development, locally through my Toronto Linux user group, regionally through the Canadian Linux user group, and internationally through the Open Source Initiative. I helped co-found Starnix, which was Canada's first Linux service provider, along, in fact, with our executive director, Matthew Rice. And in the interim, I've actually had the opportunity to spend some time working with the UN Refugee Agency, bringing open source into refugee environments, which has been very interesting. Along with that, I've been involved with various governance issues, which have all helped lead me to, doing this. I love doing open source advocacy. So into this. Okay, what is a Linux distribution? The disk you see on your screen right now is a 1993 distribution of Linux. And it had a very, very clunky way of installing. You needed to put a floppy disk into your computer. That tells you how old this was. It required a 386, 486, or 586. And it was a distribution called Yggdrasil, Yggdrasil, one of only a few at the time. There was them, there was Slackware, there was Red Hat, and there was Debian and a couple of others. And that's all there was at the time. So things have grown substantially since 1993. And so the installation method has changed. Originally, it was just floppies. Then it was floppies in a CD like this, then DVD. And now it's either by a USB stick or over a network. And so this was just a matter of people getting together saying we need to make Linux work. Linux itself is just a kernel, so how do we put this all together in a way that people can actually use it on their computers? And so this is where the pizza analogy came in. I was writing for a website called ZDNet back in the early 2000s, and a couple of other columnists at ZDNet had basically said, well, there's a couple of distributions around and they're going to go through a massive consolidation. So within a couple of years, all that's going to be left standing is Red Hat and Caldera, and I'll bet that those are the only two left standing. So I actually took one of the writers up on the bet. He hasn't spoken to me since, but I think I was on the right side of things. Not only have things not consolidated, they've gotten even more diverse. At very least, the reason that bet failed was because of the existence of Debian, which existed there, existed now, and it's actually one of the most powerful influences on the world of Linux because it actually serves as a foundation for a lot of distributions that we're going to be talking about. Diversity in the world of open source is a strength, not a weakness. The power of open source is that anyone can take a collection of Linux tools, modify them as you want, re-release them, and that's part of the benefit. That's a feature, not a bug, of working with Linux. So how is Linux like pizza? Okay, so you have variations of pizza. So you have your international chains. So you have Domino's, which is sort of like Red Hat. You have your regional chains. You have Pizza Express, which has been in the news for some things to do with Prince Andrew. You have Uno in Chicago. And you have Pizzilla in Japan, deliberately pronounced because it's a mix of pizza and Godzilla. And so you have specialty things, such as the Naples Association of Pizza Makers, which exists to protect this UNESCO heritage particular pattern of pizza. And so it's a specialty thing. And so you have all these different regional variations, including one of the favorites I found when I was looking at this. In the bottom corner is Pizza Roulette. This is a product of a place called Pizza Hell, which is a New Zealand chain. And so what they do in their pizza is they hide massively hot spices in one of the slices. So they serve you the pizza. It looks like a regular pizza. One of the slices has absolutely blistering hot spices in it. And so everyone takes a piece and, well, you get the rest. That sounds like an interesting thing, but obviously it's a specialty pizza. And of course, everyone has the ability to make your own pizza. So these have a lot of similarities to working with Linux and open source. So at this point, does anybody have any questions about the world of distributions, how there are so many in the way they're distributed?
Not at this time. Things look to be on track. Good.
Okay, so let's continue the analogy with the various components of the pizza. So the first thing we have, the crust, the foundation of everything. So the interesting thing about this part is these things don't change a whole lot between distributions. Linux itself is not a distribution. Linux is a kernel. It's the software in the middle of the system that basically makes the interface between the human and the hardware. And so that the kernel itself, Linux is the kernel. It doesn't change that much. You have different distributions that will vary which release they have. Some are more, let's take some innovation, let's do the most current release, and some will say, let's do the most stable release. And in fact, some distributions don't even use Linux. LPI does a certification in the BSD operating system. A BSD distribution in many ways is very similar to a Linux distribution, except it's using BSD as its kernel, and it's using some slightly different tools. But at the heart, the concept of a BSD distribution in its components are not very different from a Linux distribution. And LPI has a program for BSD just like we do for Linux. And other components of a Linux distribution, libraries, which are for software developers. How do you interface with the kernel? How do you interface with hardware? What's the size of the computer? What's the age of the computer? So Linux has the ability to work on everything from embedded systems to Raspberry Pis to the Google Cloud and the Amazon Cloud and the world's largest supercomputers. And you have essentially a similar kernel, obviously with some modifications, that is used across all of these architectures. Linux has been known to breathe life into old systems. I have a perfectly good Linux system running on an old Pentium 1. Why? Because they're versions of Linux that are fine-tuned to use old hardware. So in this case, you have, still as part of the crust, you have the file systems, the file layout of what's where. You have the interface to the video. You have the interface to the networking. Again, these are all at hardware level. You have support for virtualization. And so this is all still part of the core. And while these have some variation, generally speaking, right now they're all very similar between distributions. Video generally makes use of something called the X window system, although there is a migration from that to a newer architecture. The networking is fairly similar between them. And so on. File systems can vary, obviously, if you're working in a very large system with very large databases, your file systems are going to look different than they are perhaps for a small desktop, and so on. So these are all part of the Crust, the core. There's variations on scalability and age of hardware, but generally speaking, they don't vary that much from one distribution to the other. Okay, the next level on top of that, a little more variation. Okay, so this is where things start to differentiate. Whereas you have a differentiation between what is a desktop version of Linux and what is a server version of Linux. If you're doing a server, you're supporting automated processes, and you're concentrating on things like backups and multi-user administration and networking and security. And the prettiness of the desktop doesn't matter that much. In fact, a lot of server distributions don't have a graphic interface. It's all command line. And at a desktop level, okay, so what desktop do you want? There's a couple of different approaches to doing a desktop. There's, in fact, multiple ones on a Linux system. One is called KDE, one is called GNOME. There's another one that's gaining popularity called Cinnamon. Another one that's particularly good on small systems called LXQT, and that's just a very small sampling of them. And so they all have their own specialties. They all have their own fitness for purpose. You have a choice of browsers, right? Everyone has access to Chrome. There's a component called Chromium that's essentially Chrome with all the Google specific bits taken out. And it's the open source heart of Chrome. But a lot of people, myself included, use the Firefox browser. There's a couple of others, and some people will use the specialized browser to do things like go into the Tor network. These are all the kind of things where a distribution maker would choose this over that, and according to their taste, the target that they're trying to reach, or simply to satisfy themselves. Also, you have things like word processors, graphics tools like GIMP. You have chat apps, so Signal and Telegram and Skype, and others are all supported under open source under Linux. And so it's a question of a distribution maker whether or not they want to bring that in. And some will say this is special, this is important to me, and some will say it's not important at all, so it's optional, and some will say I don't support it. This is the kind of variation that you have. You also have specialized ones. So there are versions of Linux that are specifically done for kids and for education, where they'll come preloaded with educational applications. They may have parental controls on them. And so this is the kind of thing where somebody is taking a version of Linux and they're pre-packaging a whole bunch of tools and applications for a specific purpose. So you have that, you have some for some scientific environments, and of course you have some very, very bare bones versions of these that are designed for small systems, embedded systems. A Raspberry Pi with its small amount of memory and its small amount of disk is not going to have room for everything, and it's not going to have room for the speed that people might expect out of a fast desktop. So you essentially fine-tune the distribution to that. So it's a whole bunch of factors on that. The one part of this that doesn't really have a good parallel with pizza is the concept of software development, because pizzas can't replicate themselves. Whereas you can get a full suite of software development tools on a Linux system that allows you to create new applications, develop your own distribution, do your own fine-tuning, and modify things the way you'd like. The concept of open source means you have the source code, you have the ability to do all of this kind of customization. And so that's all there in front of you. Uh, so this is sort of a very, very high level overview of the kind of ways that distributions can vary from each other in terms of what they include in their packages. You have some that will throw the kitchen sink at you. So if at a high level distribution like Ubuntu will make available everything, the core installation might have many of the most used applications, but their library is huge and you can go into it and choose things that you would like. So you have a couple of those that are very general purpose. Fedora, which is associated with Red Hat, is another. So there's a couple of very, very, Swiss Army knife, kitchen sink kind of things where they throw everything at you and you have the ability to pick and choose what you'd like. And there are other ones that are highly specialized. Okay, so this goes into what goes into the distribution. Okay, so they've created everything and they've put the package all together. Okay, what next? All right, you have the delivery. So by that, I mean, okay, once they've created the package, what are all the other components to this? So you have a concept of how often do they update it? How often do they bring it current? You have some distributions that, like Ubuntu, specifically says twice a year, we're going to deliver an update and we're going to do a beta test of it and we're going to have community feedback and then we're going to launch things. And every year in April and October, you're going to get an Ubuntu release. They commit to that. Other distributions say, we'll do it when we'll create a new update when we think there's something worth updating, when there's a major release of a kernel or a major component or something like that. And then you have other distributions that have what's called a rolling release. There is no fixed distribution. There's no fixed update point. It's constantly updating. So every instance of this distribution, I think Arch is one of them, where it's a rolling update. So you install the media, and then you put in it. You basically say update everything, and it updates everything to the most current. And then on a regular basis, daily, weekly, it's automatically bringing you to the most current release. So there's no specific, we're doing this in April and October. No, there's the rolling release concept of something that is a newer concept that essentially means there's no issue of you being behind. Everyone has the most current release of it. Another concept in delivery is technical support. So this is where there can be a wide variety of things. If you have a distribution that one person has done for their own benefit, your support's going to be limited to that person's availability to talk to you. You have global distributions where they are using chat areas and discussion groups in order to be able to do support. And that works very well in some cases, although there's some things where if you go to the Ubuntu support site, there's an awful lot of unanswered questions there. So unfortunately, they've got a community, but the community is as good as their willingness to answer questions that people ask. And there's some questions that are out there that nobody's bother answering, which means you have to turn to other sources. There are other sources, but just be aware that just because there's a massive community and a massive discussion group doesn't mean that everyone's going to get their question answered, and you have to be prepared for that. At some level, you may say, I'm going to pay for support. I'm going to pay for somebody to hold my hand. I'm going to pay for the assurance that every question I have gets answered. And this has been the business model of a number of Linux distributions, most notably Red Hat, that has turned this into a business big enough to be purchased by IBM. You have a number of major commercial distributions. SUSE is another one. They partner with LPI. There's a number of commercial distributions that will offer their own technical support. And there's third-party companies that say, we'll offer you support for any version of Linux that you're going to run. We will hold your hand. We will answer your questions. The thing is, the software may be free. The people aren't free. So in cases like this, you may have support contracts. You may incur expense. Or if you choose to go the free route, then you essentially have to go through either the community or your own circle of friends, and that will very often fix things, but sometimes it doesn't. Another concept that you need to be concerned about when you're looking at how software is delivered to you is the concept of stability versus innovation. So you can have a distribution that says, we are always going to be bleeding edge. The ones with the rolling releases tend to be bleeding edge. They will get the stuff that is newest from the kernel, from the applications, from the libraries, and they'll do some stability checking on it, and then they will release it so that everyone has that. But when you have systems that are mission critical, when you have Linux systems that are being used in the largest computers in the world, in some of the largest companies in the world, uptime matters, stability matters, not necessarily having the newest software. So you have a situation where a number of distributions have the version that they release and they update very, very frequently. And another one, if you ever see the letters LTS next to a distribution, then that means that releases using long-term support. So you may have a distribution that says, we're only going to create a new LTS version every 2 years, but we're going to support those things for an awfully long time. Whereas the one that we update twice a year will do a year or two of support, and then we're going to expect you to be constantly upgrading and being current with it. So that is a different set of trade-offs that you have to make when you're considering which way you're going to go with this. And as I say, also, it's potentially the expensive part, because this is the one that if you really need support and you really need to count on having help, having it fast, having available, and having it really delivered by experts, you may be prepared to pay for it. The one other element I haven't mentioned yet is also things like multilingual support and customization. So you obviously have Linux in use around the world. That means that you're going to have support, translation, and adaptation to various cultural norms, such as different keyboard layouts, different character sets, obviously the documentation being delivered in different languages. And so you have some specialty distributions that are very heavily focused on being specific to a certain country or culture. Probably the best known of that is Ubuntu Kylin, which is heavily used in China and pretty well not known very well outside, but it is an official part of the Ubuntu family, and it is totally fine-tuned for Chinese use. Chinese keyboards, Chinese character sets, Chinese documentation. And so that's another example of the gap between here's the package of software and here's how we're going to deliver it, here's how we're going to make it useful to you. Okay, that's been a lot of ground to cover. Are there any questions at this point, Galen?
Well, we have, yes. There has been a few people struggling to learn Linux from scratch over the years. They don't seem to find any resources online that has a pointer of how to start learning Linux. And all resources claim that the only way is to jump around and learn things randomly. Is that accurate?
It is and it isn't. I mean, when you have something that's so heavily influenced by hobbyists and enthusiasts, then if you're going to go that route, you're going to be dependent on the willingness of those people to talk to you. If you send an email to Red Hat and say, I'd like to get into Linux, they're more than happy to help you from a standing start, but they're going to charge you for the privilege. The communities that have grown around the world in Linux user groups and community forums and things like that are probably the better ways to get a start into this. If you live in a major city, chances are there's some kind of a Linux user group or an open source group that meets either physically or, especially now, virtually. I've been, for instance, a member of the Toronto Linux user group now for the better part of 20 years. And they've always had a monthly meeting, and they always have had a mailing list. And more recently, for obvious reasons, the last couple of meetings have been done by Zoom, but they still welcome newcomers. They still have a policy of there are no bad questions. And so you have a lot of people around that go out of their way to try and make Linux and open source accessible. There's a couple of websites that try and offer gentle introductions. Opensource.com is a good one. LPI itself is going to be opening up a library soon uh, um, called FOSS which is also going to have good resources like this. And yeah, I understand there's a lot of sites out there, and a lot of them claim to make things easy to use and so on. But um, I would recommend perhaps going to there's a couple of Linux distributions that focus on people that have never used Linux before. And some of them, in fact, go out of their way to have a desktop that looks like a Mac or looks like Windows. So it's as familiar as possible. Uh, the names escape me this moment, but I can follow up with them later. Um, but but that's really the best way.
Yep,
Either
that's great.
choose a
That's great.
distribution that's designed for newcomers, and there are a few of them, or consult your local forum or try and find a local user group, because there are people there that are doing their best to try and welcome newcomers, because nobody wants to shut out people that want to come into this world.
That's great. And there's lots of online courses for learning Linux essentials as well.
Yes.
That's great. Um, does Linux have an avid documentation community?
Um, I
And
guess
in meaning that is kind of the usual stuff. So setting up an installation and the use of free and non-free packages, and how would someone facilitate that?
okay. It's a good question. It's a complex question. And I guess part of it depends on what you call avid. I mean, Linux has been full of advocates of people that would like to try and get the rest of the world to use more open source and to use more Linux. And so to that extent, you have a lot of people trying to do their best. However, I'll say frankly that in my own experience, these people have tend to be very technically oriented, and they've been computer programmers and software developers, and they've created some phenomenally good products in open source and on Linux distributions. Where the weakness has been is trying to make these products, trying to make these packages accessible in plain language. And so this has been a challenge. Is there a documentation community? Absolutely. It's going to vary from package to package, from application to application. Some are very well documented, some are not. You have, one of the most complex applications that I'm aware of or that I've used is called the GIMP, which is essentially the photo editing, incredibly powerful photo editing app. But I had to teach myself. I mean, there's documentation out there, but it varies in quality. And again, because a lot of these are volunteer driven, at least at the start, um, they're basically running by the quality of the people that are participating in their community. And that means that anyone here who has a knack for documentation, who doesn't like the quality of the documentation of the software you're using, please get involved. This is a community effort. And so by not, you're not paying for this, right? This is open source, this is free software. But at the same time, it's that model is dependent on people participating, and different people can contribute different skills. The software developers, they've been doing their part. Um, but that also means that there is a big role for people who have good communications and documentation skills. Pick a package you like, pick something that isn't very accessible to end users, and help it be that way. You know, you have the software developers that are doing this great job in creating the product, but they may not have the skills to be able to describe it to a new user. And so if you've got that talent or you see the deficiency, please get involved, because the community needs that kind of talent.
Wonderful. And last question for right now, and if you could just maybe use one difference and one similarity. Someone's asking the difference and similarity between Linux and Windows.
They perform a similar function. So what they do is they were called operating systems. So a Linux distribution is like a Windows system in a sense that it installs on a raw piece of hardware and it provides the interface between the human and the hardware. So when you type something at the keyboard, how does that get into your word processor? So you have the software at the low level that is talking to the hardware, it's talking to the disk drives, it's talking to the networking card, and it's turning that into something that you as a human can use. So in that sense, being the interface between the human and the computer is the function that both Windows and Linux and Mac OS and Android for that matter, and anything that you'd call an operating system, that is their function. So their function is everything from how you log into the computer to the applications that are available to you to what kind of hardware it can run on. And all of those things are brought together in what's called an operating system. Windows happens to be a version of that that was implemented by Microsoft, and they worked together with the original IBM PCs to create to create these operating systems. Before there was Windows, there was something called DOS, literally disk operating system. Windows was a graphic interface that was put on top of that, and that later became merged together into the various forms of Windows that you've seen. Linux in its own way is not that different. Linux started as it had its roots, for instance, in the way people were working with a system called Unix. And Unix was, again, an operating system. It was a way for people to talk to their hardware. It also eventually had a graphic interface that was put on top of that. So the systems in their function, in what they do for you, are not particularly different. How they do it, who produces it, is where the big difference is. So Microsoft has done Windows. They've obviously been very successful with it. It's the default on most PCs that are shipping, and it does what people need. You log in, you run your apps, you have your networking, it does that job. Linux in the open source world have an alternative approach, using open source software, using communities of volunteers, as well as corporate bodies like Red Hat and Oracle and SUSE that contribute resources to this to make it all work. I mean, right now within the kernel development team of Linux, you probably have more people who are employees of large corporations than you have volunteers who just happen to come in and know how to program. So both Linux and Windows serve a similar function in that they translate what you want to do into what the hardware is capable of doing. They just have very, very different approaches of doing it, but they accomplish the same function.
That's great. Thank you. Those are the questions that we have, so we can keep going.
Okay, so we're now into the home stretch of this. And so now we get into, all right, I've spent a little bit of time going through all the variations, and now comes the difficult part. So how do you pick between all of these? And at one level, I'm going to have to duck the question because there's no one version of it that's good for everybody. I can make a couple of suggestions, which I will, on the sort of Swiss Army knife, can do everything generalist kind of distributions, and that will be good for most people, but they won't focus on being easiest to use. There'll be different versions. There'll be different versions that will specialize in different things. So you have this massive variety. I tried looking this morning, and the number of distributions out there is in the thousands. So it's very, very easy to be overwhelmed. There's a website I'm going to take you to on the last slide where you'll be able to check things out. And if you really want to go into detail about what's popular and what's new and what's just come out with news, there's ways to track that kind of thing. But if you're just coming into this, that gets very, very overwhelming. So there's essentially two or three of what I'd call generalist, that sort of Swiss Army knife kind of distributions, where they can give you everything, but they're still fairly basic to be able to install. The other issues that you want to deal with is, what's popular versus stability. If you look at what's hot right now on the websites that are following distributions, things get hot. This is the flavor of the month. This is the hot distribution that everyone's trying out right now. Well, lots of people will try out things and then they'll come back to their old reliable. I've spent a lot of time experimenting with different distributions, and I end up very often coming back to the ones that I depend on. And some of that may be simple, familiarity issues, and some of it may just be these new ones aren't compelling enough to me. But the point is, there's all this choice, and as you get deeper into this, you can choose to get involved in this huge diversity of things. But at the very beginning, if you're just starting, at this point, I would recommend one of the flavors of Ubuntu, which is a sort of, you can't go wrong with it. Purists will have their problems with things, and of course, we have that diversity because not everyone agrees with them on everything. But Ubuntu generally has gotten most of the things right in terms of coming up with a system that's reasonably easy to install, that has a very, very large worldwide community behind it, and has some variation. So as I mentioned, there's that Chinese flavor called Ubuntu Kylin. There's also one called Edubuntu, which is an Ubuntu that is focused on education. So Ubuntu itself is a distribution, but it's also a family of distributions, which allows you to go to the site and pick one that's maybe closest to you. And so what are all the things that you need to consider when you're actually doing this? So what's your comfort level? Are you capable of compiling code on yourself, on your own? Do you need a lot of hand-holding? That's going to help determine which of these you want. So some of these, there's one called Gentoo, which is a wonderful distribution, but I would never recommend it to a beginner because its path is difficult, and it installs its code by compiling everything on the fly, which is great if you're trying to do very, very heavy fine tuning, but you need to have a little bit more expertise in this stuff before getting into that. Another factor is, how important is it to you that something is pretty? Because you have pretty distributions that have spent an awful lot of time on getting that graphic interface just absolutely perfect. But they may not have the smarts to be able to support you if you wanted to run, say, a database server on it, or you wanted to do some other things on it. So you have some systems, like I say, that try and go overboard to make themselves accessible. If you're using a Windows machine and you're doing a transition, or you're using a Mac and you're doing a transition, there are a couple of distributions that are focused on trying to make your life easy, but do they have the large communities that Ubuntu has, or that the Red Hat Fedora community has? Not really. So at that point, you have a trade-off. I would say that if I had to make a suggestion of the best thing to get involved right now, it would be one of the major flavors of Ubuntu. And at that point, which of those is it? Then it comes down to look and feel, your personal preference. Have a look at them. What looks better to you? And at that point in time, there's some variety in that. And then it's a matter of going online, having a look at the screens, seeing what works better for you. And at the end of the day, if you have friends or acquaintances or people around you that are already using Linux and open source, that may even be your best source. What are they using? When you have a lot of choices around you, but your friends and your acquaintances and the people you work with or go to school with are all generally agreed on one version of Linux, they're going to be your best source of support and handholding. So that may be a good influence on what you're going to use. So if you go to a local user group, or you have a local circle of friends that's already using Linux, and they're already saying, well, I use this one. Well, even if it may not be your first choice, that may be the place where you're going to get the most help. So that is definitely going to have an influence on where you make your choice. So these things, what is your hardware? If you're using slow hardware, that limits you to the versions of Linux that run on slow hardware. If you want something very fine-tuned to a purpose, then go for it. But if you're just coming into Linux right now, I'd suggest sticking with one of these all-purpose distributions. And if you really want to get really deep into this, then this is the website right now that essentially is monitoring all of the distributions. And so they'll tell you what are the most popular ones, and they'll tell you what's the news going on with each of them, distrowatch.com. But again, this is a place where it's very, very easy to get overwhelmed. And it's also very easy to get, I won't say incorrect advice, but maybe inappropriate advice. So for instance, if you look on that page of DistroWatch, it's giving you a list of the top 30 distributions. But what it says top 30, it basically means how many people clicked on that on their website. And so that's all they're counting. So when they talk about what's most popular, they're saying what got most hits on their website. It's not necessarily what most people are using. It's not necessarily what's the best for most people, but it's the one that attracted the most interest. So the one at the top right now is called MX Linux. I tried it. It's fine. It's okay. I didn't find any compelling reason to it. So after using it for a little while on a test computer, I went back to my standard. And this may be something that you want to do. Don't be afraid to experiment. The one thing is, on your computer, you won't damage any of your computer. Be careful because if you're going to partition the disk on your computer to install Linux, obviously you're going to wipe out what was there before. A lot of versions of Linux, including the general purpose ones I talked about, allow you to dual boot. So when you boot up, it says, do you want your old Windows or do you want Linux? And it lets you boot between them. I have that rig on my laptop right now because there's a couple of things that require Windows, unfortunately. And so when I boot up my computer, it says, do you want Windows or do you want Linux? And they can both coexist. You can't run both at the same time. There are some tools that try to do that, but I haven't had much fun with them. But you boot up your computer and you can boot it up Windows or you can boot it up Linux. And that's actually not particularly difficult to do, especially if you have some friends who have some experience with this. And so, but you won't damage your hardware. You won't get a fried video card. You won't get a blown disk drive simply because you tried to use Linux. Also, Ubuntu and a couple of others have what's called a live install, where it literally runs the version of Linux as a demo and it runs it off the USB stick, meaning you don't have to install anything on your disk drive in order to use it or test it. And so this is a good way to boot it up off your USB stick, have a look around. It'll be obviously limited in what it can do and it will be slower, but it will give you a really good demo of how things will work. And then it says, okay, do you want to install it onto your disk? And then you have the choice of saying, either I want to have that coexist with my existing Windows, or I want to wipe up my disk drive and use the computer for Linux exclusively. So you have those choices. The one thing is, when you're doing your demo, when you're playing with it this way, just don't go to the step of partitioning your disk if you don't want to lose what you already had. But you do have that ability. A number of the distributions have the ability to do that demo, just running it off the USB stick. And that, in fact, to me, is a good way to just satisfy yourself that what it's offering looks good enough to you and is going to work the way you want and allow you to make the choice whether to install it on your computer or not. And so that is basically it. And so since obviously part of the question of this is, okay, what do I use? So what I use now is Kubuntu, which is a version of Ubuntu that uses a graphic interface called KDE, which is a personal preference of mine. A lot of people use Ubuntu. I use something called Kubuntu. The only real difference between them is their graphic interface on top. Under the hood, they're almost identical. Raspbian is one that I use because I have a couple of Raspberry Pi devices. And that is the version of Linux that's very finely tuned to work on the Raspberry Pi. It's meant to work with its limited resources, and it does a very good job of it. The current version of the Raspberry Pi, this wonderful little $45 US computer, is capable of replacing most people's desktops, and perfectly good. Runs two HDMI screens, has the power and the networking to do it, and this little computer has been fantastic. So I use Kubuntu on my large systems. I use Raspbian on my Raspberry Pis, and for my pizza, I go to a chain called Pizzaville, which is a Toronto area chain that I happen to really like. And that's it. So, are there any other Q&A for at the end of this?
That's great, Evan. Thank you. A couple questions here. Any suggestions for server editions of Linux?
Uh, for server editions, well, so for instance, there is such a thing as Ubuntu Server Edition, which effectively is Ubuntu without the graphic interface. So in other words, it boots up and it goes right to a command line. So it doesn't even bother installing a graphic interface and is able to give all of the resources of the computer to the server functions. Um, but that's nothing special. It's possible to go to another one of the major distributions, such as Fedora, and say, I want to install this, but I don't want a graphic interface on it. The real difference between a server and a desktop is the installation of the graphics, which you don't want. And also you may choose to have a different file system types, which are more conductive to fast database access and the kind of things that you would be wanting to run on a server. Uh, the core distribution isn't very different from a desktop to a server. They're fine-tuned and they come with different sets of tools. You would be able to take one of the mainstream distributions, any of them, including Gentoo, including Linux Mint, which I haven't mentioned yet, including a number of others, and just say, I want a server edition, don't install the desktop graphics, and instead let's concentrate on installing the tools that I need to be able to run the server, meaning I want to install my web servers, I want to install my databases, I want to put in my networking security tools and things like that. A lot of things that you wouldn't have on a conventional desktop system.
Okay, wonderful. Which one is the best distribution optimized for cloud computing infrastructure?
Oh my.
Yeah.
Uh, if I had to give you an honest answer, it's probably the one that's custom designed within AWS that they probably haven't released publicly. I mean, in terms of working on the cloud, uh, I don't know if I have the ability to recommend the best one. In fact, to say what is the best one for any combination of variables, uh, I don't claim to have the expertise to know what's the best one in every situation. Like I say, if you really wanted to, one of the general purpose ones like Ubuntu or Fedora could be fine-tuned to do that. Are there Linux distributions that are specifically tuned to work in a cloud virtualized environment? There are. I'm just not myself particularly familiar with them. I'm sure going to one of the sites like DistroWatch, or as I said before, going into some of the discussion groups or joining a local user group will probably get you the answer you want better than you will from me.
Great, thank you. And one last question here, a bit more toward the LPI certification. Um, is there a huge difference between the LPIC 1 and LPIC 2 certification?
Okay. Um, well, well, the first thing that I wanted to mention in the context of this discussion is that one of the things we've been very, very proud of at LPI is being able to make a certification program that essentially works across all of these distributions. We've wanted to be distribution neutral from the day we started, and we've generally succeeded in that. In that the kind of things that would be involved in the LPI program are things that would be that stuff underneath that's common to every Linux distribution, of tuning the kernel, of administering users, of working with the security. In terms of the difference between LPI level 1 and LPI level 2, they're essentially different degrees of the same thing. For an LPI 1, it's what you would need to be a junior system administrator. And It covers off the basics of what you would need to know. The level 2 goes into more detail about things like setting up servers and doing more advanced security. Rather than give this kind of sort of overview, I would really recommend that you go to the LPI website, and we have detailed objectives for each of our programs. So if you go into the section of the website on certifications and go to LPI level 1 and go to LPI level 2, uh, it will go into extreme detail about what is covered in level 1 and what is covered in level 2. By going into the objectives, it will tell you in great detail what are the things we're testing in LPIC level 1 and level 2 at a detail that I can't possibly cover totally here.
Perfect. Question here. What is the, in your opinion, or you best you can, is the best distribution for security at the moment?
There's there's a couple that focus on security. Uh, the one that does the most, I'd say, that says this is a security distribution is called Kali Linux. I don't have a lot of experience with it, but it has a lot of things like intrusion detection tools and things like that. These are tools that you would be able to find on most of the general purpose distributions, but Kali and a few others like it focus on the security aspects, not only on locking down a system, but also on trying to do defensive security, so intrusion detection and honeypots and things like that. You'd find in the specialized distributions out of the box, though a lot of the mainstream distributions are capable of being configured that way. There's a couple that sort of come pre-configured with those things in mind. So the one that I'm aware of is Kali. There certainly are others like it. So you could go with that route, or you could, like I say, if you're familiar with Ubuntu or Fedora or one of the mainstream distributions, you're going to find those tools in those systems as well. They're just not part of the initial package that you would install.
Great. That is all the questions that we have so far. So Evan, thank you very much. A lot of fantastic information here. That's all the time we have for today, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us. I will be sending around the presentation slides, recording, and some contact information if there's any follow-up questions for Evan or for anyone at LPI. So thank you again for those who joined us on Zoom and those who joined us on YouTube. Have a wonderful rest of your day.